Russia is burning, not metaphorically, literally, across a corridor stretching from the Volga refineries to the air bases ringing Moscow. Fires are still being fought as I record this. Smoke columns visible from commercial airliners, fuel depots that fed the southern front gone in a single night, and the Russian air defense network, the same network the Kremlin spent 2 decades telling its own population was the most advanced layered defense on the planet, failed, not partially, categorically. What you are witnessing is not a raid. It is not a stunt. It is not a symbolic strike timed for a news cycle. What you are witnessing is the largest coordinated drone operation in the history of modern warfare, and Russia could not put it out, could not intercept it in time, could not predict it, could not contain it, and cannot, in any meaningful operational sense, prevent the next one. Let that sink in for a moment. The country that built its entire post-Soviet identity around strategic depth, around the idea that distance itself was a defensive weapon, has just been told by Ukraine in fire and steel and 1,000 simultaneous flight paths that distance no longer exists, that the rear is the front, that the assumption Russian generals built their war plan on in February 2022 was not just wrong, it was the trap. This is not a story about a drone swarm. This is a story about the collapse of a doctrine. And before this analysis is finished, you will understand not just what happened over those skies, but why it was always going to happen, why mainstream coverage is missing the real significance, and why the lesson from this operation will be studied at Sandhurst, at West Point, at staff colleges across NATO for the next 20 years. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level. To understand why this swarm changes everything, you have to rewind, not to last week, to 2022. Because the assumptions Russia carried into this war were not invented in 2022. They were inherited from a Soviet operational tradition that treated airspace as something you owned by mass, by sheer quantity of interceptors, radars, and surface-to-air missile batteries layered in concentric rings around what the general staff defined as critical assets. Moscow, the Caspian flank, the strategic bomber bases at Engels and Alenia, the petrochemical complexes that fund the war. That doctrine had a specific name in Russian staff literature. It was called the protected rear. The idea was simple, and on paper it was elegant. You concede that the front line will be contested. You accept that aviation will take losses near the line of contact, but you guarantee that anything more than 400 kilometers behind the line is sanctuary, untouchable, beyond reach. The factories keep running. The refineries keep pumping. The bombers keep flying sorties from bases that no enemy can credibly threaten. That assumption was the foundation of Russia's entire war economy. Every logistics calculation, every fuel depot location, every missile production schedule, every bomber dispersal plan was built on the premise that the Russian rear was geometrically safe. Not safe because of active defense, safe because Ukraine, the Kremlin reasoned, did not possess and could not develop the reach to threaten it. This is where the first mistake was made. And the first mistake was not tactical. It was psychological. Russian planners assumed that reach was a function of platforms, of bombers, cruise missiles, long-range aviation, things Ukraine did not have. They never seriously modeled what would happen if reach became a function of swarms, of distributed, low-cost, autonomous systems launched from Ukrainian territory, from friendly territory abroad, from concealed positions inside Russia itself, in numbers that no Soviet-era air defense architecture was ever designed to absorb. Pull the lens back. This is the variable Russian doctrine could not see, because Russian doctrine was written in a world where the cost of one strike approximated the value of the target. When a cruise missile costs $2 million and a refinery costs $2 billion, you defend it. You can afford to defend it. The math works, but when the strike costs $40,000 and you are launching 750 of them in a single night, the math inverts. The defender goes bankrupt before the attacker runs out of munitions. That inversion is the hidden military variable that every mainstream analyst is still failing to name. And it gets even more serious from here, because Ukraine did not arrive at this capability by accident. It was built methodically over 36 months through a sequence of milestone strikes that, taken individually, look like provocations or symbolic raids, but taken together form one of the most disciplined campaigns of doctrinal escalation I have observed in my career. Let me walk you through that chronology because the chronology is the proof. Phase 1, late 2022 into early 23. Ukraine begins striking targets inside Russian territory using modified Soviet-era reconnaissance drones, the Tu-141, the Tu-143, repurposed as crude one-way attack platforms. The strikes hit angles. They hit Diaghilevo. They damage strategic bombers on the tarmac. Russian state media dismisses them as accidents. Western analysts dismiss them as one-offs. Both readings are wrong. What Ukraine was actually doing was probing, mapping radar coverage, identifying gaps in the Russian integrated air defense network, calibrating fusing, terminal guidance, and flight profiles against a real adversary's actual response. Phase 2, mid-2023 through 2024. Ukraine industrializes. It moves from converted Soviet drones to purpose-built long-range strike platforms, the Lyuty, the Bober, then a generation of systems whose designations are still classified. Range expands from 400 kilometers to 800 to over 1,400. Production scales from dozens per month to thousands. And critically, Ukraine begins operating these systems in coordinated packages, not single strikes. Coordinated multi-axis raids designed to overwhelm specific sectors of Russian air defense at specific times of night, exploiting fatigue cycles in the operator rotations, exploiting weather windows, exploiting maintenance schedules. Phase 3, 2025. The strikes stop being symbolic and start being economic. Refineries at Ryazan, refineries at Volgograd, pumping stations along the Druzhba pipeline, fuel depots at Tuapse, Novorossiysk, and Krasnodar. The targeting logic changes. Ukraine is no longer trying to humiliate Russia. Ukraine is trying to bankrupt Russia. By the autumn of 2025, Russian gasoline exports had collapsed by an estimated 18% year over year. Domestic fuel rationing was reported in Crimea and Sochi in the Belgorod region. Refining capacity was running at the lowest level since the early 2000s. And then comes this operation, the one we are discussing tonight, the largest coordinated drone swarm in the history of warfare. Over 700 platforms launched in overlapping waves across a 6-hour window. At least 84 confirmed impacts on Russian critical infrastructure across 9 regions. Strategic bomber dispersal sites hit in 3 separate locations. Refinery complexes burning from Saratov to Ryazan. Air defense radar installations destroyed at points the Russian general staff considered structurally invulnerable. This matters enormously. And here is why mainstream framing is missing it. The mainstream coverage you are seeing on cable news tonight will describe this as a major Ukrainian drone attack. They will count the impacts. They will show satellite imagery of the fires. They will interview a former diplomat who will say it complicates ceasefire negotiations. And then they will move on. They will treat this as an event. A discrete news item with a beginning, a middle, and an end. That framing is not just shallow. It is wrong. It is wrong in a way that obscures the actual military significance of what occurred, because what occurred was not an event. What occurred was a demonstration of capability that fundamentally rewrites the operational map of this war and of every future war involving a peer or near-peer adversary. Let me explain what I mean. The real question is not how many refineries burned. The real question is what the swarm proved doctrinally. And what it proved doctrinally is this. A modern integrated air defense network, even one built on the most sophisticated layered architecture available, S-400 batteries, Panzer close-in systems, Tor-point defense, networked radar fusion, can be saturated by an adversary willing to invest in mass over precision. The threshold at which saturation occurs is now empirically demonstrated. It is somewhere between 300 and 400 simultaneous threats per sector. Below that, the network holds. Above that, the network fails. Catastrophically. Not gracefully. This is the lesson every general staff in the world is studying tonight. The Chinese are studying it. The North Koreans are studying it. The Iranians are studying it. NATO is studying it because the implication is enormous. The implication is that the cost curve of strategic defense has just been broken permanently. The defender now has to spend exponentially more to defend than the attacker spends to attack, and at some threshold of swarm density, no amount of spending closes the gap. Pull the lens back further. This is what makes the operation a case study rather than an incident, because the same logic applies to American carrier groups in the Western Pacific, to Israeli air defense in the Levant, to NATO forward bases in Poland and Romania. The drone swarm is not a Ukrainian innovation that happens to be hurting Russia. The drone swarm is a structural shift in the economics of military power, and Ukraine just ran the largest live fire validation exercise of that shift in human history against the country that loudest insisted it could not happen on its own territory. Now, let me walk you through the industrial consequences, because this is where the story moves from a battlefield event to a state-level catastrophe. Russian refining capacity before this operation was already operating at a structural deficit. The cumulative damage from 18 months of Ukrainian deep strike campaigns had reduced effective throughput by an estimated 22%. After this swarm, preliminary assessments, and I emphasize preliminary because the fires are still burning, suggest an additional 8 to 12% reduction. Combined, that puts Russian domestic refining at roughly two-thirds of its pre-war baseline. What does that mean in practice? It means fuel rationing will spread from regional pockets to systemic policy. It means agricultural output in the breadbasket regions of southern Russia will be constrained by diesel availability during the spring planting season. It means military logistics, already stretched by frontline consumption rates that planners did not anticipate, will compete with civilian demand for an increasingly scarce commodity. It means inflation in fuel-adjacent sectors will accelerate. It means the Russian state will face a choice between feeding its army and feeding its economy, and that choice has historically destabilized regimes far more secure than the one currently sitting in the Kremlin. And it gets even more serious from here, because the strategic bomber component of this operation is in many ways more consequential than the refinery component. Refineries can be repaired. They are expensive to repair. They take months, but the technology to repair them exists, and the engineering workforce, while degraded, is still present in Russia. Strategic bombers are different. Strategic bombers are not repaired, they are replaced, and Russia cannot replace them. The Tu-95 production line was shut down in 1992. The Tu-160 production line was effectively dormant for 2 decades and only partially restarted in 2018 with output measured in single airframes per year when the supply chain cooperates. Every Tu-95 destroyed on the ground at a dispersal base is not a bomber that returns to service in 18 months. It is a bomber that is permanently subtracted from the Russian strategic order of battle, forever. The fleet that existed at the start of this war was the fleet Russia would have for the rest of the century, and that fleet is now measurably smaller than it was last week. Estimates from open source imagery suggest this single operation may have damaged or destroyed between 4 and 7 additional strategic bombers. Add that to the cumulative attrition from prior strikes, and you are now looking at a Russian long-range aviation force that has lost approximately 1/3 of its pre-war strategic bomber inventory. 1/3 to a country the Kremlin in 2022 publicly described as incapable of fielding a credible air force. History will record this, not the cable news version, the Staff College version. History will record that the Russian Federation, which inherited the second largest strategic bomber fleet on Earth from the Soviet Union, allowed that fleet to be attrited by 1/3 in a war it chose to start against an adversary whose strategic strike capability it dismissed using a class of weapon, the cheap autonomous drone, that Russian doctrine refused to take seriously until it was too late to adapt. That is a verdict. That is not an opinion. That is what the historical record will show. Now let me bring you to the climax of this operation, because within the larger swarm, there was a single coordinated action that I believe will be remembered as the defining tactical moment, the way Pearl Harbor or the Six-Day War opening strikes are remembered. And it concerns the airbase at Engels 2. Engels 2 sits roughly 700 kilometers from the nearest point on the Ukrainian border. By Russian doctrine, it was a sanctuary. The base hosts a significant portion of Russia's nuclear-capable strategic bomber fleet. It is ringed by Pantsir batteries, S-300 and S-400 systems, electronic warfare jammers, and a layered radar network that, on paper, should detect any inbound threat at over 400 kilometers and engage it at over 200. That is the paper. Here's what actually happened. Sometime between 0247 and 0431 local time, a coordinated package of approximately 120 drones approached the base from three separate axes. From the southwest, low altitude terrain massed along river valleys. From the south, medium altitude, pre-programmed to draw radar attention and fuse interception priorities. From the southeast, the actual main effort, exploiting a known seam in radar coverage that Ukrainian intelligence had been mapping for over a year. The Panzer batteries engaged. They engaged effectively, in fact, against the first two waves. They expended a significant portion of their ready magazine missiles in the process. Then the third wave arrived, and there was nothing left to fire. The base went dark on radio. The dispersal pads were hit. Multiple bombers burned. The fuel farms secondary detonated, and the secondary detonations destroyed additional aircraft on adjacent pads. This is the design. This is what I mean when I say doctrine. Ukraine did not just send a lot of drones. Ukraine designed a saturation sequence with feints and main efforts and timing pulses that exploited the specific magazine depth of the specific defensive systems present at that specific base. That is not insurgent improvisation. That is staff work. That is intelligence-driven, doctrinally mature, peer-grade military planning executed by a country that 3 years ago was being told by Western military attachés to prepare for a government in exile. The question was whether Ukraine could scale this from a one-off proof of concept to a sustained operational tempo. That question has now been answered. The answer is yes. And that answer changes the war. Because if Ukraine can do this once, it can do it again. If it can do it again, it can do it monthly. If it can do it monthly, then the Russian strategic rear is no longer protected. It is contested. And a contested rear is by definition no rear at all. The entire territorial logic of the Russian war effort, the assumption that mass and depth would eventually grind Ukraine down, depended on the rear being a sanctuary. Take that sanctuary away, and you do not have a war of attrition anymore. You have a war of mutual industrial destruction, and only one side in that war has access to NATO industrial capacity, Western intelligence sharing, and a coalition of allies underwriting its long-term financing. Let me close with what I think this means going forward, because the strategic forecast is the part that matters. In the next 90 days, expect three things. First, expect Russia to attempt a doctrinal response. That response will likely involve a frantic redistribution of point defense systems away from the front line and toward critical rear infrastructure. That redistribution will weaken Russian frontline air cover, and Ukraine will exploit that weakening with increased tactical aviation activity along contested sectors. The swarm will have produced a second-order effect that hurts Russia at the line of contact. Second, expect Russian strategic communication to shift. The Kremlin cannot keep telling its population that the rear is safe. It has tried that frame for 36 months, and reality has overtaken the frame. Expect a pivot toward a narrative of besieged endurance, of patriotic sacrifice, of accepting hardship in the name of historical destiny. That pivot is itself a confession. Regimes that need to invoke historical destiny are regimes that have run out of operational arguments. Third, and this is the one I want you to watch most carefully, expect a strategic decision in the Kremlin in the coming weeks about whether to escalate horizontally, by which I mean whether to attempt to widen the war through hybrid operations against NATO infrastructure, through cyber attacks, through pressure on a vulnerable third country, in order to force a negotiation that freezes the conflict before the swarm doctrine fully matures and before refining capacity collapses below the threshold at which the Russian war economy can function. That decision is the next inflection point. And how the West responds to it will determine whether this war ends with a settled Ukrainian victory or with a frozen conflict that simply waits for its next phase. The broader lesson here is one I want every viewer to carry with them. We are watching in real time the obsolescence of an entire generation of military assumptions. The assumption that strategic depth equals safety. The assumption that expensive defenses can defeat cheap offenses. The assumption that mass conscription armies can absorb attrition, that volunteer professional forces cannot. The assumption that nuclear powers cannot lose conventional wars to non-nuclear adversaries. Every one of those assumptions is being tested in the skies over Russia tonight, and every one of those assumptions is failing. Russia thought distance would save it. Ukraine ended that illusion. Russia thought mass would save it. Ukraine's swarm proved that mass without doctrine is just a target list. Russia thought time would save it. The refineries are burning faster than the engineers can repair them. What history will record about this operation is not the number of drones, not the number of fires, not the number of bombers lost. What history will record is that this was the night the protected rear as a concept in modern warfare died. And it died at the hands of a country that, by every Russian assumption made in February 2022, should not have been capable of inflicting it. The question now is not whether Russia can recover. The question is whether the Russian leadership understands what just happened to them, whether they understand that the war they thought they were fighting, a war of mass, depth, and patience, is not the war they are actually in, whether they understand that the adversary they dismissed has outthought them, outbuilt them, and outfought them at the doctrinal level that matters most, the level where wars are actually decided. I am not certain they understand it yet. The signals out of Moscow suggest they do not. And that uncertainty, the gap between what has happened and what the Russian command structure is willing to acknowledge has happened, is itself the most dangerous variable on the strategic board right now. Because leaders who do not understand why they are losing tend to make the decisions that turn a manageable defeat into a catastrophic one. Stay with us, because those decisions are coming. The next 90 days will reveal whether the Russian leadership is capable of strategic learning under pressure, or whether the rigidity that produced this catastrophe in the first place will produce the next one. Either outcome will reshape the war. Either outcome will reshape the post-war order. And either outcome deserves to be analyzed not as breaking news, but as what it actually is.